In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Sancta Joseph,
Ora pro nobis,
Sancta Gertrude,
ora pro nobis,
Sancte Pie Decime,
ora pro
in
nobis.
nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Okay, this is Sacred Liturgy. We should finish this book, Born of Revolution. We left off at liturgical thimble rig, whatever that is. Bonini, it seems, was a past master at the old game of thimble rig. Footnote. Equivalent of the modern shell game, it has been part of the con artist repertoire at fairs and race courses since ancient Greek and Roman times. The old game of, what's the modern shell game?
It's when they would get a ball and they would put it under, they'd have 3 shells and they would put one of the balls under a shell and then he would mix them up. So you have to keep your eye on where the ball is.
Oh, okay. Thimble rig, okay. In which the rapid sleight of hand deceives the eye. By means of abstraction, substitution, and transposition, he, Bonini, and his colleagues on the commission managed to radically reconstruct the entire Easter Vigil while making it difficult to keep one's eye, as it were, on the ball. First, Bonini uprooted the Veniat prayer from its connection with the incense. By a process of shell shuffling, his confederates on the commission whisked it away to be redeployed for the blessing of the Paschal candle, having first changed its wording. The word cereum, candle, was added to fit its new found purpose. If we think this move was trivial and inconsequential, unworthy of prolonged attention, we are much deceived by the operator of the scam. Where's the ball, Anthony?
As in all shell games, there is more in the move than meets the eye. It raises the question, where does that leave the exultet, the magnificent hymn which the Church had been using since at least the 7th century as the framework for blessing the Paschal candle? Its function was recorded in ancient sacramentaries as the Benedictio Cerei, blessing of the candle, and was faithfully handed on to us over the centuries until the 1956 reform. That, however, was before the shells were shuffled again, and the exultet suddenly lost its traditional function. It found itself changed from a rite of blessing and consecration of the Paschal candle to simply a hymn of praise.
No, that's true. This is the 55 reform, and it is true. What this author is saying is very true, because I did the now as a priest. I've done the pre-55 the last 4 or 5 years, but all my priesthood was always the 55 reform, and that's all it is. It's a hymn to the candle, and at most you incense it. But in the pre-55, you're singing the exultet, but then you're putting the grains of incense in as part of the ceremony. And you're lighting it as part of the ceremony. So it's actually blessing it, consecrating it, and not just singing to it. So that is true. Read on.
This was hardly an innocent or inconsequential transposition, given the succession of changes that logically ensued, and which, therefore, must have been intended. For if the exultet has lost its raison d'être,
reason for existing,
in the blessing of the candle, the ceremonial procession leading to that climactic event also loses its theological significance. An examination of the 1948 Memoria will reveal the specious reasoning behind these changes. By this means, it will become painfully obvious that when Bugnini and the Commission had finished rearranging the shells, some ancient ceremonies were discontinued, having been absorbed and replaced by innovations and that different liturgical forms and some doctrinal content has simply disappeared. As the content of the memorial shows, the Papal Commission operated as a lobby group with the evident intention to bend the ear of Pius XII so as to influence future legislation on the liturgy. Below, using the internal evidence of the memorial itself, we will see how the Commission set out to achieve its aims. First, it created a fake controversy over the authenticity of the Church's centuries-old Lex Orandi, making it seem that somewhere along the way the Church had made a wrong turning. Then, having cast doubt on the integrity of tradition, it proceeded to control the terms of the debate as follows.
Vaniat or exultet, the pseudo-controversy, or as they say in England, controversy. Gabriel?
Basically, the dispute, invented by the Commission out of thin air, was about whether the Church had erred in using the exultet, rather than the veniat, to bless the Paschal candle. Dom Lombard Baudouin had no less hesitation in calling it a quote-unquote profound error. Father Antonetti, on behalf of the Commission, presented the status
questionis, the state of the question.
Thus, quote, everyone knows that in our missals the hymn Exultet is called the Benedictio Cerei, blessing of the candle. And the liturgists have posed the question as to whether the deacon can bless the candle. But historians of the liturgy know very well that the real prayer of blessing of the candle is the veniat, which today has come to be used as the blessing of the grains of incense, in spite of the fact that the same text clearly refers to the candle and its light. The exultet is the real preconium pascale, and should be given back its original title, while the prayer veniat should once again become the benedictio cerei.
Cerei. Yes. Go on.
We are left to marvel at how many false or tendentious remarks he could fit into one paragraph. Who the historians are is not disclosed, but from Antonetti's account, their opinions have much credibility as the plotline of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code novel, insofar as both are rooted in misinformation and constitute a concealed, indirect assault on the integrity of Catholic tradition. Let us take each of his points in turn.
Excuse me. Start over.
Let us take each of his points in turn. Father Antonetti begins by challenging the Church's right to have the blessing of the candle during the exultet, and plants a seed of doubt about the deacon's role in performing it. Baudouin, for his part, complained that, quote, the deacon never blessed any object, especially before his superiors, end quote. As any competent historian of the liturgy would know from the early centuries of the Church, it was the deacon's office to light the Paschal candle, and that he was also given the privilege of performing its blessing during the exultet. The priest is, of course, the ordinary minister of blessings, but at the Easter Vigil, the deacon was given the exceptional privilege of acting as his deputy to bless the candle, using the flame from the new fire and the 5 grains of incense blessed by the priest earlier in the ceremony. Father Antonetti did not mention that this tradition was based on an immemorial custom of well over 1,000 years, being attested to in the ancient Gallican sacramentaries. For example, the 7th century Missale Goticum, one of the forerunners of the Roman Missal. Nevertheless, the Commission decided to bring it to an end in 1956, without, however, being able to offer a single good reason for the change.
Michael, from reduced blessing to no blessing.
That was how the blessing of the candle was peremptorily transferred from the long, elaborate, and impressive hymn of the Exultet, sung by the deacon in the sanctuary, to the one-paragraph prayer of the Veniat, spoken by the priest outside the church. Baudouin commented on this low-profile arrangement. He noted with satisfaction that in the 1956 reform, the blessing was carried out privately, by which he meant in a less visible manner and without elaborate ceremony. Once again, the reformers displayed a certain squeamishness about blessing material objects, which sits ill with Catholic tradition. Furthermore, this demotion was a transitory stage to the Novus Ordo, in which the Paschal candle is not blessed at any stage of the Easter Vigil. The new rite mentions only the, quote, preparation of the candle, end quote, not its blessing.
So the Novus Ordo would drop it altogether. No blessing at all. I didn't even realize that. An unnecessary controversy, Anthony?
Was there any need to change the blessing of the candle from the Exultet to the Veniat? Let us examine the Commission's claim that the Veniat was the quote-unquote real prayer of blessing and should have been retained, while the Exultet, which the Church had chosen for that purpose, was, by implication, unauthentic. The historical evidence shows that neither blessing was, in fact, any more or less real than the other. Both have an excellent pedigree of roughly similar antiquity in the Galatian and Gallican sacramentaries, respectively. As the Exultet eventually became more popular and widely used, indeed, it became the most prized of all the jewels of the Easter Vigil, it was both obvious and natural to the Church. It was both obvious and natural that the Church gave it priority over the other prayer for inclusion in the Roman Missal as the blessing of the candle. It is noteworthy that this priority arose not by bureaucratic fiat from on high, as in the 20th century reforms when the Veniat was imposed, but from the historical fact that the Exultet proved to have more widespread popular acclaim. In other words, the blessing of the candle was not legislated by a commission or other tribunal, but emerged as an implicit preference among the community of the faithful, and that before the expression, quote-unquote, organic development was invented.
Sacrificing truth to power, Gabriel.
By 1956, it is evident that unseen interests were exerting enormous control over the future of the liturgy. The text of the Memoria was available only to insiders and to no one else. Under cover of secrecy, the Commission attempted, and failed, to prove that the Church had made a faux pas.
Faux pas, a bad move.
We can now say that it was not simply unscholarly, but dishonest to claim that the Veniat was the real prayer of blessing of the candle, and that it should supplant the immemorial custom of the Exultet. There is absolutely no evidence to support that claim, much evidence against it, and even more evidence that the liturgical quote-unquote science underpinning it was fabricated. We can conclude, therefore, that the Commission members arrived at their judgment only by leaving out a key element of liturgical history, its quote-unquote organic development, and skewed the historical evidence to fit their a priori theory. This is a typical example of how the Commission took a counter-position against long-established universal traditions simply on the basis of their own subjective preferences. As with the rest of the Easter Vigil, indeed with the entire Holy Week, centuries of hallowed customs were scrutinized by members of the Commission with a view to eradicating them on flimsy or false pretexts. Thus, the lex orandi, the very locus of sanctification of the faithful, and the principal means of replicating the faith in successive generations, became a particular target of officiousness and bureaucratic control. The Commission worked to ensure that tradition would henceforth no longer be master in its own house, but had to cede authority to abstract theories, beloved of liturgical quote-unquote experts and historians.
The procession of the Paschal candle The decision to transpose the blessing of the candle from the exultet to the veniat had another unwarranted effect. It changed the theological significance of the procession from a carefully choreographed pageant dramatizing the fact of the resurrection as a historical event to an unstructured melee in which the paschal candle representing the risen Christ was outshone by the people's candles. For many centuries, the process of bringing the fire to the paschal candle was part of the complex of features that gave the Easter Vigil its unique and recognizable identity. In the Church's immemorial tradition, this is pre-55, this was accomplished by the deacon carrying in procession a triple-branched candle representing the Holy Trinity. As the procession of clergy advanced into the church, the three candles were lit successfully to honor each person of the Holy Trinity. At each lighting, the deacon sang the threefold Lumen Christi, and the choir responded, whereupon all genuflected. The final destination of the procession was the sanctuary, where the unlit paschal candle was already in place, waiting for the deacon to light it from one of the three candles. This tripartite symbolism was calculated to make a lasting theological impact on the faithful. For those who were waiting inside the unlit church, this was a pinnacle moment, the climax to which the procession was leading. It illustrated in the most visually dramatic way the doctrine that it was the Holy Trinity, represented by the triple-branched candlestick, that effected the resurrection. It was a statement without words that Christ raised himself from the dead by his own divine power. So it's a very, very powerful audio-visual Mother Church uses. And you have the Trinity, you have the Paschal candles lit from one of the candles, which represents God the Son, who became man, born of the Virgin Mary, hence the virgin wax, the virgin beeswax that's white, symbolizing the Virgin Mary. The illumination of the triple-branched candlestick. So people would say the modernists would complain, people missed the candlestick. So it's just a little thing that we had to drop. But, well, it's not just a little thing. Michael?
The Commission eliminated the ceremony of the triple candle with its Trinitarian symbolism and replaced it with a procession involving active participation of the laity, leaving it, as we shall see, with only secondary, if not exactly marginal, connections with the resurrection. What this amounts to in practice, in practical terms, is an attempt to censor or silence the liturgical expression of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. It was a pattern which was replicated not only during the rest of the Holy Week reforms, but also in the creation of the new Mass. The most obvious effect of suppressing the symbolism was to give the impression that belief in the actual physical, that is, bodily resurrection of Christ, the chief of his miracles, as proof of his divinity, is not something that should be taken too literally. This was the position of the mid-20th century progressivists, successors of the early modernists, who succeeded in spreading doubts about the great supernatural interventions of God in human history. The theological modernists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had been working to reinterpret and demythologize the sacred scriptures by explaining away the miracles and focusing on inner spiritual experiences instead of revealing truths. Consequently, their progressive successors in the liturgical movement were determined to suppress the supernatural content of the liturgy and make it as man-centered as possible. Their influence in the liturgical movement was beginning to make itself felt in the Holy Week reforms of Pius XII. We are therefore justified in raising the question, did those members of the Commission who proposed the reforms which accompanied which accommodated the ideas of the neo-modernist, hold the integral Catholic faith. To ask the question is to answer it. Here, however, we are less concerned with the presumed intentions of the reformers than with the reforms themselves and their internal logic. Our brief is an objective examination of certain affirmations made by Father Antonelli in the Memoria, and the conclusions to which they logically lead.
Okay. So modernists do attack the resurrection of Christ and downplaying the triple candle and the prayers just fed that modernist orientation. Returning to the analogy with an orchestra, Anthony?
Thinking of the traditional Easter Vigil ceremonies as an orchestra playing a piece of classical music composed of different movements can help us to see how much damage was done by the 1956 reforms. The procession itself was a masterpiece of artistry, in which the lighting of each candlestick worked in counterpoint to the corresponding genuflections to produce a harmonic progression towards the crescendo, the lighting of the Paschal candle. And the text of the Exultet states that the candle is lit to the honor of God, in honorem Dei. It was a fitting climax that this should take place at the precise moment during the Exultet, when the text mentions the lighting of the candle.
Purpose of the procession undermined. Go on.
But when the reformers reorchestrated the procession in 1956, they cut out and added on whatever they pleased. By suppressing the triple branch candlestick, they upset the balance and harmony of the orchestra. The tripartite candle had acted as a kind of masthead, identifying itself as a symbol of the Holy Trinity and displaying the purpose of the procession, which was to light the Paschal candle. When it disappeared, the corresponding threefold Lumen Christi and the three genuflections were left without their intended counterpart. As the relationship between each instrument in an orchestra is one of complementarity, this fundamentally changed the combination of elements in the symphony. The effect was like trying to play Mozart's flute and harp concerto without, say, the flute. It would be a lopsided creation, a monument to organizational failure, because the sound would be off balance and not ring true to the composer's original intention. While it is inconceivable that any conductor would commit such a desecration, it transpired that the commission actually accomplished something similar in the Easter Vigil with Bugnini at the podium.
The people-centered right. Gabriel?
What the purpose of the Reformed procession was in relation to the resurrection is unclear. The Paschal candle was lit, but without ceremony, before the procession began. A comparatively poor reception for the fact of the resurrection, and a definite anticlimax to the traditional rite. And carried through the church so that everyone, without distinction of clergy or laity, could light their own individual candle from its flame. The whole process was not only an astonishing innovation in the Roman Rite, but also a considerable distraction from the main point of the vigil, as it diverted attention away from the centrality of Christ to the people. The Paschal candle, which was supposed to show the light of Christ coming into the darkness of the world, was outshone by the constellation of candles in the hands of the laity, illuminating the darkness far more effectively. Yet this was not an oversight by the Commission. The new arrangement was chosen intentionally by the Reformers to make the following point. The people, by merely holding a lighted candle, were encouraged to think of themselves as the bearers of the light they had received at baptism, as if it could never have been lost since then. This was confirmed by Father Clifford Howell, Society of Jesus, one of the foremost proponents of the 1956 reform. With reference to all the clergy and people at the vigil, he stated, quote, "Their candles now shine with the flame received this night from the Christ candle. Their souls live with the life received from Christ in baptism." End quote. What this reform shows is that the theologically unfounded optimism about human nature, which later surfaced at Vatican II, had entered the liturgy in the mid-1950s. For all the preceding centuries of its existence, the Church had wisely emphasized the frailty of human nature, its propensity to sin, and its constant need for the light.
Where once there was harmony, now there is discord. The procession was not the only element of the Reformed Easter liturgy that underwent a change of character, either through modifications to its form and content, or through a novel interpretation of its role. We have seen how the Exultet lost its operative principle as the blessing of the candle, and was reduced to a mere text, while an entirely new ceremony was invented for the candle. Yeah, that's right. In the pre-55, the candle's incensed, just on the side right there, with much dignity and beauty. While in the new Reformed liturgy, twice in the ceremony, at least twice, the priest, the Paschal candle's in the middle, at the foot of the altar, and the priest goes around it incensing the candle, which is, well, say what you want, it's a new ritual, a new rubric. We have seen how the Exultet lost its operative principle as the blessing of the candle and was reduced to a mere text, while an entirely new ceremony was invented for the candle, just going around and incensing it, for example. Bearing in mind that the omission or rearrangement of even one element in an orchestra, or the addition of an extraneous element, could upset the balance and harmony of the ensemble, we can conceptualize the damage done to the traditional vigil by the omission of 2/3 of the scriptural readings. Of the original 14 prophecies, only 4 remained in 1956. In the Memoria, Father Antonelli explained the reasoning behind this reduction. 4 points. First, in the time of St. Gregory, there was only 4 prophecies, they say. Second, there's nothing special about the number 12, therefore no absolute need, necessita absoluta, to stick it out. 3, 12 readings are a real burden, vero onere, on everyone concerned. And fourth, in our day, it is inappropriate to subject the laity to the readings in Latin. It is not entirely true that the Gregorian Sacramentary had only 4 prophecies. Unknown to the Commission, it also had a supplement containing 12 Old Testament readings in widespread use in the Caroline Genera. Besides, there is no convincing reason why the Commission should single out the Gregorian system as the model for the 1956 Easter Vigil. At that relatively early period in its history, the Roman Rite was still in its embryonic stage and was in the process of absorbing elements from 7th century Gallican and other sources, which had many more readings. For example, footnote, the 8th century Gelasian Sacramentary had 10 readings and 10 corresponding collects. The Byzantine liturgy had 15. The Lateran Basilica had twice as many as it appeared because they were read in both Latin and Greek for the benefit of the Greek-speaking faithful in Rome. The Church finally settled for 12, the same number as in the 5th century Easter Vigil in Jerusalem. And they remained in this form over the centuries until, what year?
1956.
Evidently, the Commission saw no reason to respect this immemorial tradition. We must note a curious irony here. The Commission had set itself the task of returning the liturgy to its primitive foundations in the first centuries of the Church, and cutting out whatever it considered to be later, quote, accretions. Yet it rejected the number of scriptural readings which had characterized the earliest known Easter Vigil, that is 12, for a small fraction found in an interim stage of development of the Roman Rite. This reform is all the more reprehensible because once the norm of 12 had become established, the Sacred Congregation of Rites have repeatedly forbidden any diminution in the number of readings, adding that all must be sung entire. Footnote, Adrian Fortescue, Ceremonies of the Roman Rite Described, page 327. He writes, Fortescue writes well before the council, I think in the 1920s. All right, a concession to anthropocentrism, which means man-centeredness. Michael?
The Easter Vigil Reform, which started in 1951 on an experimental basis, is the earliest evidence we have that the Reformed Vigil was primarily geared towards the comfort and convenience of the assembly. By characterizing the 12 prophecies as too much of a burden, it might as well have said too long or boring for all concerned. The Commission presented the traditional liturgy as a form of oppression from which the faithful needed to be liberated. According to this perverse view, the faithful were incapable of deriving spiritual nourishment from the traditional liturgy, and it must, therefore, be tailored to suit their perceived needs. Such a conclusion about the faithful is both condescending and shallow. It ignores the true method of participation, whereby they engage in understanding and praying the liturgy with hearts and minds without necessarily knowing the meaning of all the Latin words. St. Thomas Aquinas explained, quote, "Although some may not understand what is being sung, they understand why it is being sung, that is, for the praise of God, and this is enough, even if the faithful do not, strictly speaking, sing in order to rouse their devotion," unquote.
St. Thomas, Summa
Theologica
Secunda,
Part
Secunde, question 91, article 2. Go on.
For the most part, they were simply drawn to the message of the text, sung by the choir in Gregorian chant. In other words, a lively faith was paramount, and an instinct for God. Little else was needed. Before these unnecessary reforms, the whole of the Church's liturgy, most especially in Holy Week, was imbued with the spirit of sacrifice. Yet, of this indispensable requirement, the Commission made not a mention. Instead, turning all previous wisdom on its head, it allowed the liturgy, for the first time in the Church's history, to be imbued with the spirit of the world, catering to the baser human instincts for a less burdensome form of worship.
A significant omission, Anthony?
Although the Reformed Rite retained the reading from Isaiah chapter 4, there was still something missing. Its first verse was cut out in 1956. What was so objectionable about it that modern ears had to be shielded from its prophecy? The missing verse highlighted the importance of marriage as an essentially patriarchal society established by God for the procreation of children. It is not without significance that this procreative purpose was not clearly affirmed at Vatican II as the primary end of marriage, but downgraded and conflated with other ends, contrary to both the natural law and the biblical teaching. But the first overtures to the radical feminist agenda had already been made in 1956 with the omission of Isaiah 4 verse 1 from the traditional liturgy.
The importance of the 12 prophecies. Anthony, go on.
For the ordinary Catholic, questioning why there were 12 prophecies was superfluous. It was enough to recognize, without the need to analyze, why there was that number, that it was the immemorial tradition of the Church. The lengthy readings were chosen to emphasize that the redemption had been predicted by the patriarchs and prophets throughout the Old Testament. In order to make the point most cogently, the readings were skillfully crafted into 3 distinct groups of 4 nocturnes, each with its own theme, giving the full history of our redemption from the creation to the resurrection. But in the Reform, most of the accounts relating to the resurrection were suppressed. For example, Noah and the Ark, as in the Palm Sunday blessings, Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, Ezekiel's vision of the valley of the dry bones, Jonah and the whale, the 3 young men in the fiery furnace. Their relevance to the Church is that they were all figures of the death and resurrection of Christ. Significantly, the instruction accompanying the decree Maxima Redemptionis, 1955, lacks any mention of this connection. In its contemporary on the Old Testament readings, it simply states that in them, quote, the great deeds accomplished by God in the Old Covenant are commemorated, pale images of the marvels of the New Testament, end quote. Thus, any specific reference to the resurrection as a fact of history predicted in the Old Testament is avoided.
Now that is a doctrinal, subtle attack on the doctrine of the resurrection. So just remove all the very clear references to the resurrection. Daniel in the lion's den, Noah in the ark, Jonah in the whale, etc. We'll go on.
We are left wondering what the real reason was for the drastic reduction in the Easter Vigil readings. In their attempt to offer the faithful an easy-riding liturgy, the progressive reformers detached the essential element of the lex credendi from the lex orandi, which underpins it. All they succeeded in doing, therefore, was to deprive the whole church in 1956 and the modern-day users of the 1962 Missal of the full panoply of prophecies which pointed to the resurrection of Christ.
Yes. All right. Easter Vigil, chapter 17, Easter Vigil from rational order to chaotic abandon. So it's still going on with the Easter Vigil ceremonies here. So that's how big it was. So the changes were not all that slight in 56. The blessing of the font, Gabriel.
In the pre-1956 liturgy, the blessing of the baptismal water took place in the baptistry, the part of the church, or even a separate building, where the font was traditionally located. The clergy would process from the sanctuary to bless both the font and the water it contained, while the choir chanted the relevant section of Psalm 41, Sicut Jedvus. As with the Paschal candle, this procession was also a clear and shining example of theology in motion. Those who approach the font are compared to the heart in Psalm 41, which yearns for the fountain of living water. It would be useful to keep this visual metaphor in mind when we come to examine the Reformed version.
Liturgical shambles. As a result of the invidious schemes drawn up by the 1948 Commission, what happened next put another blot on its already sullied record. True to form, the Commission played havoc with a part of the Easter Vigil liturgy, following the readings of the prophecies, turning what was one of the most ancient and supreme works of Catholic tradition into what can only be described as a scene of total disorder and confusion. As we shall see, this section of the Easter Vigil was radically configured and became a farrago, structural and ritual changes peppered with inconsistencies and quirks. Instead of blessing the water and administering baptisms in the designated place where the font is located, these actions were performed in the sanctuary while the priest faced the people, coram populo. This necessitated the use of a bucket or other receptacle for the baptismal water, while the font, which had been continuously used for 16 centuries, was suddenly made redundant and its symbolic importance consequently diminished. Monsignor Gromier pointed out at the time the effects of dislocating the symbolism of the font from its liturgical context. And here he says, quote, baptismal fonts, baptismal water, and baptism go together as one. A spectacular innovation that deliberately separates them, installing substitutes for the font in the sanctuary and baptizing in them, then using this receptacle for transferring the baptismal water to the font, is an insult to history, to discipline, to the liturgy, and common sense. So, Monsignor Gromier, it would have been something to meet him. He was vilified by the liturgical establishment for daring to criticize the Holy Week reform. It is richly ironic that he was regarded as having lost his wits, when it was the authors of that reform who appears to have lost their liturgical compass. The revised ceremony of the baptismal water did indeed fly in the face of logic and common sense. Okay, we'll stop there. Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini.
Quivet Shalom.